The rain poured heavily, soaking the streets of Portland. Officer Daniel Carter was driving slowly through a quiet part of the city when his headlights caught a small figure huddled by the side of the road. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Pulling over, he stepped out into the rain, his uniform instantly drenched. The figure was a little girl, no older than 4, shivering as the water drenched her thin clothes. Her tiny hands were wrapped around her arms as if she could somehow warm herself in the freezing downpour. "Hey there, sweetie," Carter said softly, kneeling beside her. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The little girl looked up at him, her big brown eyes filled with fear and sadness. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Mommy doesn't want me anymore." Carter's heart clenched at her words. This was no ordinary lost child. Something was very wrong. Earlier that day, Aaliyah had been sitting quietly in her room, clutching the last photo she had of her father. Her father had passed away months ago, and since then, her life had been nothing but a nightmare. Vanessa, her stepmother, made no attempt to hide her disdain for Aaliyah. When Aaliyah asked Vanessa why she didn't love her like Daddy did, Vanessa snapped, her words sharp as a knife. "Your daddy's gone. And now, so are you." Vanessa grabbed Aaliyah by the arm and dragged her out into the rainy street, leaving her there with nothing but a cold glare. As the door slammed shut behind her, Aaliyah's world collapsed. She was utterly alone. Back in the present, Officer Carter drove Aaliyah to the station. He wrapped her in a blanket and offered her hot chocolate, his eyes full of concern as she sat in silence, staring at her small hands. "You're safe now," he said gently. "I'm not going to let anything bad happen to you." Aaliyah didn't say much, but the look in her eyes told him she wanted to believe him. Carter felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility for this little girl, and though he knew he had to follow protocol, he wasn't ready to let her out of his sight. Officer Carter sat across from Aaliyah in the dimly lit room at the police station, trying to coax her into speaking. She remained quiet, eyes downcast, fidgeting with the hem of the oversized blanket wrapped around her. Each time Carter asked her a question about her family, her little shoulders tensed, as though the weight of the world rested on them. "I miss Daddy," she whispered, almost too softly to hear. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she wiped them away with her tiny fists. Carter leaned forward, his voice steady and warm. "I know, sweetheart. And I'm sure he misses you too, wherever he is." It wasn't easy to get through to her. A child psychologist arrived shortly after, but Aaliyah clung to Officer Carter's side, refusing to speak to anyone else. It was clear that she had formed a small bond with him, the only adult who had shown her kindness in a long time. Carter knew her fragile heart needed time to heal, but he also knew that time wasn't on their side. The police department began their investigation into Aaliyah's home life, starting with her stepmother, Vanessa. They visited her modest home in a quiet part of town. When they knocked on the door, Vanessa opened it with a forced look of concern. She feigned surprise when the officers explained that Aaliyah had been found wandering alone in the rain. "Oh my goodness, I've been so worried," Vanessa said, placing a hand over her heart. "I didn't even realize she was gone. She must have wandered off when I was busy." But the officers weren't convinced. Neighbors reported seeing Vanessa yelling at Aaliyah on multiple occasions, and some even mentioned witnessing her cruel treatment after Aaliyah's father passed away. The dots started to connect. Vanessa had grown cold and neglectful, abandoning her stepdaughter in the most literal and heartless way possible. The police continued to gather evidence, and suspicions around Vanessa's true nature began to solidify. It became clear to them that this wasn't just a case of neglect, it was deliberate cruelty. While the investigation unfolded, Aaliyah remained under the temporary care of Officer Carter. He had set up a small space for her at his apartment, just until the authorities could find a more permanent solution. Aaliyah was still quiet most of the time, but little by little, she began to open up. They spent their days together, with Carter taking time off from his shifts to stay with her. He would make her breakfast, pack snacks for the park, and sit with her while she colored or watched cartoons. The more time he spent with her, the more he realized how much he cared for her. Aaliyah had begun calling him Uncle Daniel, and Carter couldn't help but smile every time he heard her say it. His heart warmed as he saw her slowly start to trust again. She was just beginning to regain a sense of normalcy, though he knew her wounds ran deep. Vanessa's lies started to unravel quickly. The evidence against her mounted with each passing day. Neighbors provided testimony about the abuse, and when confronted with the mounting accusations, Vanessa crumbled. In an interview with detectives, she finally admitted that she had abandoned Aaliyah, though she tried to justify her actions by blaming the stress of single parenting. The case moved swiftly, and the courts ruled Vanessa unfit to care for Aaliyah. It was a victory for Aaliyah's safety, but the emotional damage Vanessa had inflicted couldn't be undone overnight. Aaliyah was officially placed in the foster care system, but Officer Carter couldn't shake the feeling that this little girl was meant to stay in his life. Though Aaliyah was now safe and in a stable environment, the trauma of her abandonment still haunted her. At night, she had nightmares about being left in the rain, crying for her daddy. Some mornings, Carter would find her curled up on the couch, too afraid to sleep in her own bed. Her fears ran deep. She worried that, like Vanessa, Carter would grow tired of her too and send her away. Every time she called him Uncle Daniel, she would look up almost, as if waiting for him to tell her to stop, but he never did. Carter noticed these small moments of anxiety, and his heart broke for her. He reassured her every chance he got, but he knew it would take more than words to make her believe she was truly wanted. Officer Carter's own life had never been easy. He grew up in foster care, bouncing from one home to another, never feeling like he belonged anywhere. It wasn't until he became an adult that he found his sense of purpose through serving the community as a police officer. Now, seeing Aaliyah go through the same struggles, he couldn't help but feel connected to her on a deeper level. He understood what it felt like to be abandoned, to feel like you had no one to turn to. He began to entertain the idea of adopting Aaliyah. It seemed crazy, given that he was a single man with a demanding job, but every day with her made him realize that he couldn't let her go. He wanted to be the one to show her what a real family was, one built on love and security. Deciding to adopt Aaliyah was one thing, but the legal process was another. As a single man, Carter faced challenges in the adoption system. There were strict guidelines and requirements for adopting a child, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. He hired a lawyer and began the long, complicated process of proving he was capable of giving Aaliyah the home she deserved. His colleagues rallied around him, offering support in any way they could. The community, too, had heard about his bond with Aaliyah and began advocating on his behalf. Still, the road was fraught with hurdles. The system was built to protect children, but sometimes it felt like it was working against him. Carter wasn't about to give up, though. Aaliyah was worth the fight. After months of legal proceedings, Carter's determination paid off. The courts finally granted him temporary custody while the adoption process continued. Aaliyah officially moved in with him, and the small apartment that once felt empty now felt like a home. Aaliyah was still healing, but her once fragile heart had begun to mend. She smiled more often, laughed at Carter's jokes, and even started to call him daddy. Each time she said it, Carter's heart swelled with pride and love. Though there were still challenges ahead, Carter knew they were building something solid together. They were creating a family, one day at a time. With each passing day, Aaliyah and Carter settled more into their new life together. They established routines. Carter would drop her off at daycare before heading to work, and in the evenings, they would go to the park or cook dinner together. Aaliyah's nightmares became less frequent, though there were still nights when she crawled into Carter's bed for comfort. He never turned her away, knowing that her scars would take time to heal completely. But the important thing was that she no longer felt alone. Together, they began to heal, Aaliyah from the trauma of her abandonment, and Carter from the loneliness he had carried with him for so long. Just when things seemed to be going well, Vanessa reappeared in Aaliyah's life. She filed a petition to regain custody, claiming that she had changed and wanted to make things right. It was clear to everyone that Vanessa's sudden interest in Aaliyah wasn't genuine. She was after financial support and had no real desire to raise the child she had once abandoned. But the legal system required the courts to take her petition seriously. Carter knew he had to prepare for another fight. He wouldn't let Vanessa hurt Aaliyah again. The courtroom was tense as the final custody hearing began. Both sides presented their cases. Vanessa, with her slick lawyer, argued that she deserved a second chance. Carter, with his lawyer and a long list of character witnesses, made it clear that Aaliyah's best interests lay with him. Aaliyah sat quietly in the courtroom, clutching a small stuffed bear that Carter had given her. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew one thing: she didn't want to go back with Vanessa. When it was finally time for the judge to make a decision, the entire courtroom held its breath. The judge ruled in Carter's favor, officially granting him permanent custody of Aaliyah. Vanessa's petition was denied, and she was ordered to stay away from Aaliyah. The court recognized the deep bond between Carter and Aaliyah, and it was clear to everyone that they were a family now. As Carter and Aaliyah left the courthouse hand in hand, they knew that their journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, but they would face them together, as father and daughter. The story of their love and resilience would continue, forever bound by the family they had chosen to create.